Welcome, everybody. I'm Joe Moore, CEO, co-founder of Psychedelics Today. We are here for a three-part conversation, a series of panel discussions. Our very first panel will be about consolidation in the psychedelic industry. Panel 2, how to apply for licenses in Oregon. As you all know, mushrooms will be legal in January in Oregon in some use cases. And then finally, opportunity and challenges in the emerging ketamine psychotherapy industry. We've got some very great hand-selected panelists and moderators, and we're very excited. I really appreciate you all coming out. And if you have to run out, we'll get this on YouTube later, but there's room for question and answer and networking here. So be sure to check out the panel tables or the breakout rooms at the end or in the middle if you get bored. Hopefully you don't. Don't think you can here. So really excited to kick this off. Our first moderator is Philip Milestone and Counsel at Zuber Lawler. And yeah, thank you to everybody for being here and playing a part. So let's get this rolling. Welcome, Philip.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction to this morning's session on consolidation in the psychedelics industry, what to expect. My name is Philip Milestone. I'm counsel at Zuber Lawler. Lawler is a global law firm. We deal in psychedelics space. Actually, one of my first questions to our esteemed panel is going to be the pros and cons of calling this space an industry. But Zuber Lawler deals in psychedelics, cannabis, we do blockchain, good old-fashioned M&A, you name it, we do it. By all means, please check us out at zuberlawler.com. I'm so happy to be joined today by an amazing panel of folks who are deeply involved in psychedelics from many different places. Who is going to talk to us about funds involved in this space. Rector. He's the founder of Empath Ventures, going to be talking to us from that perspective. Swati Sharma works in journalism and psychedelics, and of course, Peyton Nyquist is the CEO and founder of Numinous. I could not possibly do them justice, so I'm going to give each of them 3 to 5 minutes or so to just tell us how things are going. Brom, you're at the top left of my screen, so lucky you. Please tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Philip. My name is Brom Rector. I'm the founder and general partner of Empath Ventures. Empath Ventures is an early stage venture capital fund that invests solely in psychedelic medicine companies, specifically through sort of an impact and ethics perspective. We've invested in 10 companies so far, most of them at the pre-seed and seed stage. And I think one of the things that kind of separates us from some of the other psychedelic venture capital funds out there is that a lot of the other funds are focused almost entirely on the biotech angle of psychedelics. So whether that's trying to get classic psychedelics approved by the FDA or trying to invent new psychedelic molecules, we invest in that stuff, but we also look at the clinic side. We also look at the infrastructure and accessories side. We try to sort of cover the entire psychedelics industry. So yeah, that's a bit about what Empath Ventures does and a bit about me.
So much, Brom. Just going to my right, Lindsay, please tell us.
Hi, Philip. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Hoover. I'm co-founder and managing partner of JLS Fund. And we invest at a very exciting intersection of science, technology, and neurology, catalyzed by the potential of plant-based and psychedelic medicines to both heal illness and enhance wellness. So our umbrella, if you will, goes beyond psychedelics and beyond drugs to encompass other elements and areas of mental health investment, including sensors, virtual reality, wearables, digital therapeutics, et cetera. So we really see psychedelics, to your earlier point about, is this an industry? It's really psychedelic medicines, we think, are a subsector of central nervous system medicines to start, but it looks like the impact goes beyond that to anti-inflammation and probably to general health. So it's super exciting. So yes, it falls into biotech and pharma, but also this whole use of psychedelics really highlights just the challenges of at least the immediate large challenges of the mental health crisis. That's a global crisis. That's a very expensive crisis. And we think that the medicines are going to be more effectively deployed in conjunction with other technologies and other tools. So we invest in drug development and delivery technologies, supporting and enhancing software and technologies and related consumer products and services, so pretty much across the spectrum.
That's interesting point. Swati, please, you are next. Tell us a little bit about the work you do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Swati Sharma. I am the Executive Director of Psychedelics Spotlight, and our platform is essentially covering the movement of the psychedelic space, both the markets as well as policy, legislation, culture, and just the general industry as a whole. So we're really excited to be a part of this conversation, contributing from a media perspective and how we kind of envision all of this industry to move in the future.
So much, Swati. Last, certainly not least, Peyton, if you could please tell us about your work with Numinous.
Sure. Thanks, Philip, and grateful to be joining everybody here today, joining everybody from the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I'm Peyton Nyquist, co-founder and CEO of Numinous. Numinous is a mental health company looking to advance and make accessible psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy through our network of clinics, both in North America and both in Canada and the United States, as well as a licensed laboratory and production facility that's licensed by Health Canada to do not only analytical testing, but also importation, distribution, and production of pretty much all the known psychedelic compounds.
Well, everybody attending, you can see we have a stellar panel talking to us from many different aspects and perspectives of psychedelics. Everybody in the chat, by all means, I see questions in there about audio and other technical challenges. I can't help you there, but good luck with it if you need some assistance. There will be some time later for questions and answers. I'd ask you, up near that chat, there's an option for a Q&A. So by all means, suggest your question. The topic at hand. Swati, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you. As the journalist on the panel, I think you probably have more experience in the first instance of framing questions. And the first question I'd like to ask is a framing one. We're talking about consolidation in the psychedelics industry. Could you give me some pros and cons of framing psychedelics as an industry? Certainly, we've seen cannabis move from one set of adjectives applied to it to another. And that might not be the perfect analogy here. So by all means, let me know and let us know your take on framing psychedelics as an industry.
Sure. I think that the psychedelic space is wide-ranging. There's the industry's part of the movement, which is essentially the medicalization of psychedelics. And then there's also kind of this scene, this underground scene that has existed for a long time in the space where they have been working with plant medicines and in different capacities. And then there's just the average psychedelic user who's using psychedelics for whatever purpose that they're looking for, whether that's recreationally or for their own personal healing. So it's interesting to actually frame this as an industry because it's not only that aspect, I would say. I think that it is a culture in itself. And that's something that we are going to see more of in the future as this movement continues to expand. So I'm excited to have our platform be able to capture all of that information and provide the correct resources and trustworthy source so that we can actually tackle this in the safest, best way together.
Like description of psychedelics as a culture, sort of the third adjective. Culture. Lindsay, please, you were talking about your work with JLS as
I'm sorry, Philip, I'm not hearing your question. I don't know if I'm the only one having trouble making out part of what you're saying.
I also don't hear Philip either. I can't hear him.
I think your microphone, maybe you need to speak really specifically into it. It feels like when you turn your head, maybe we're losing you.
So I'm going to try to consume this microphone as I ask my questions. Is this any better? Awesome.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to speak loudly and clearly directly into this microphone. Swati, thank you very much for that response. I loved your addition of the adjective of culture to psychedelics. So now we've got these different avenues: psychedelics space, psychedelics culture, psychedelics industry. Lindsay, you had spoken in your introduction about JLS's work both horizontally and vertically in the space. Please, what's your take on the pros and cons of describing psychedelics as any of ACE, ecosystem, culture, industry?
As one of my partners would say, it's an and. I think there is a cultural aspect, there's a historical aspect, there's a definitely an underground grassroots movement, but I believe that what's really happening here is people around the world, probably starting here, are demanding agency over their health, but really more specifically their mental health because of the failure of the treatments that have been in vogue or in use. The antidepressants, which are only effective for 30% of people and have terrible side effects, starting with electroshock therapy all the way to, abstinence or methadone treatment for addiction. We're talking about addiction, PTSD, supreme anxiety and depression, and they're mushrooming. These problems are getting much, much worse, and people are saying, look, you, the medical establishment, you're not giving us anything that works. And in fact, what you are giving us is often deadlier than the condition. So we're demanding anything. And I think it's great to think of a culture, but I also like to think of someone's grandmother being able to access therapies as well. So really, the goal, in my view, the broader overarching goal of this subsector should be making the most effective treatments available with the least side effects and downside to the greatest set of the population possible at the most reasonable and in the most reasonable and efficient way. I love the culture. I guess I'm probably part of the culture, and I really resonate with that. And I think Brom will probably talk a lot about how that culture is weaving in with this movement. But for us, it's about taking agency over your mental health. And really, if your mind is the captain, and the captain's, not at the wheel or not in control, you're not in control of your life. And so mental health, there is no health without mental health, as I like to say. So really this is for everybody.
Thank you. I mean, that's beautiful. And I think it's important that adjectives maybe don't matter. It's much more, people taking agency, call it what you will. But the important thing is getting people what they need, when they need it, and how they need it in an effective way. In terms of that and incisive comment, Peyton, you had mentioned sort of import and export and dealing with this, as one would any other widget. I would say, does that mean your perspective is more sort of you adopt the industry model, or would you say no, the industry is the wrong adjective?
Yeah, I would agree with what Swati mentioned and Lindsay as well. I think it's a culture more than an industry. I think we're in an interesting time, if just from a healthcare perspective, where we're seeing this paradigm shift within healthcare and healing. And I think the use of psychedelic drugs is a part of that cultural shift. And when we talk about mental health, that's included in that as well. But I agree. I think it's interesting to kind of call it an industry, and maybe that's an easy way to bucket it for people looking to make investments into the space. But I think you're seeing this shift in regards to drug policy change in terms of even drug development and accessibility, and then infrastructure platform and things like that as well. But I would agree. I think it's more of a cultural environment than necessarily an industry. I think different industries are looking at different ways in which that culture is affecting the way that they're looking to do business. If I think about, as we were talking about earlier, around us as a mental health clinic company who has been culturally affected and looking to support the psychedelic industry and how that integrates within the mental health environment that we're in at the moment. So, and I think you see that even with indigenous use and things like that as well, where culturally these are medicines that have been used for thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah, and I think that history speaks a lot to the description of this as a culture. I think before anything was an industry, right? It had you. This is not something created in the lab, right? This is a culture older than the United States. I mean, certainly, probably older than many other nations. Mm-hmm. It's an important perspective to remember. Brom, I'll give you the last word on this. Empath Ventures, as you described in your introduction, takes a very broad approach to investing in companies from very many different verticals. So I would ask you. Is there an adjective that you enjoy, or are you like Lindsay saying, forget the adjectives, let's talk about agency?
I generally do sometimes I use the word space, which is very vague. I hear that one a lot. I think kind of, the original question was like, are there pros and cons to using the word industry? And I certainly use the word industry, although, I haven't thought too deeply about it. I'll be honest. I would say that, one pro of calling it an industry is that in the United States and in the realm of sort of global capitalism, calling something an industry adds an air of legitimacy to it. If the hippies in the 60s had an industry, it might not have been so easy to, ban the drugs and take them away. As soon as something can make money, as soon as something is seen as an investable asset, all of a sudden it's legitimate in, at least in the world that we live in. I'm not saying that's how I like it, but that is kind of, part of just the reality. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, it wasn't until after we saw people, big well-known investors start putting money into psychedelic companies that all of a sudden we started seeing more positive mentions of psychedelics in sort of, the mainstream popular press. So I think that, yeah, the calling it an industry certainly has some benefits. Although obviously there are downsides. If it gets too industrialized, then, that could certainly hurt a lot of people that have been into sort of the more cultural and traditional aspects of psychedelics. Another con is that if you call it an industry and use that term as sort of an all-encompassing group to, encompass both the biotech companies, the non-biotech companies, plus like the people using psychedelics at festivals, then it makes everyone perceive all these people as part of the same like homogenous group, and bad actors in maybe one part of that sort of entire group can damage the reputations of people in the rest of the group, even if they really aren't that connected. So I guess those are sort of my pros and cons.
I will say that I am a little disappointed that the second wave of music and fashion and art that we saw with the first wave of psychedelics has not yet really started, with the exception of a few indie films. So artists, performers, musicians out there, show us your game.
I guess maybe that's a downside of it not being called a counterculture, right? It being counterculture has regulatory consequences that are not awesome. At the same time, it might have a stigma to artists who say, I don't want to go mainstream. And if psychedelics are now mainstream, I mean, part of me says, hooray. Part of me says, oh, no. But with all of that said, right, so we have opinions on whether it's an industry or not. That's debatable. I would say it's probably not debatable that consolidation is happening. And that is both good and bad. So I will go back to you, Brom, please, if you don't mind. And when we're talking about consolidation, in the psychedelics industry, you are investing in several different companies, assuming you're looking at this, as an industry with the mindset of, ROI. What are you looking for as you are contemplating investments?
So broad question. We look for a lot of different things. In terms of to frame this around the idea of consolidation, I think that it's kind of undeniable that consolidation is largely going to happen when you're talking about the drug development companies. I think it's kind of impossible to imagine a future where there ends up being a small number of dominant sort of biotech, pharmaceutical, psychedelic companies that end up, buying up most of the rest of them. But that doesn't mean that the entire psychedelics industry is going to become extremely consolidated. I am not convinced that the future of psychedelic medicine is necessarily going to be driven entirely by biotech. Oregon is going to decriminalize psychedelic therapy before any pharmaceutical clinical trial gets approved by the FDA. And assuming that goes well, I think that laws in Oregon are going to get even more liberal, and I think other states are going to copy that. And people try to distance psychedelics from the cannabis world, but I think it's not crazy to think that the future of psychedelics looks a lot more like cannabis is now than a lot of people, especially those that are trying to, pump up their biotech company valuations, would like you to believe. So while consolidation may happen on the biotech side, they will still be competing against what will likely be a very fragmented and decentralized and unconsolidated recreational, state by state level decriminalized, state by state level medicalized, whatever you want to call it, industry, which will be fragmented just due to the nature of how fragmented the laws and regulations will be. So when I am looking at companies, I am looking for companies that will profit off the biotech side, but I am also looking for companies that will be able to survive and thrive in a world that is much less pharmaceutical and much more state by state level, decriminalized, medicalized, whatever you want to call it.
It's a brilliant perspective and a brilliant dichotomy, right? Looking at the space like a forest, you need the redwoods and you need the small trees. Swati, as you're reporting on the space, and as given Brom's comprehensive description of it, what factors do you see sort of driving consolidation?
There's a number of factors that can drive consolidation. We're finding that there are some companies that are not necessarily well equipped financially to be able to make it through the research process. And so they have valuable research available. It's just a matter of whether they're able to continue through that. So they're good candidates for being acquired through this process. And we're kind of seeing this happen already. Some smaller companies are collapsing, some are merging. And this is just going to kind of continue throughout the industry side of the psychedelic space. So that's something that we are seeing. We're also seeing pharma also taking some space within this area with Johnson & Johnson, for example. They recently had their own ketamine nasal spray put out. So that's also something I think to keep in mind, that they will also be entering this area. And then we also have to consider what that would look like amongst, the psychedelic biotech focused companies. So yeah, that's some of what we're currently seeing.
Thank you. It's a great perspective to sort of step out from the industry. So I'm going to go the other way and step in. Peyton, as everybody on the panel knows, and I'm sure most of our audience knows, your company's recently actually gone through this process. Could you please take the moment and tell us sort of on the ground what you were considering as you went through this process and why?
Yeah, I think echoing what Brom and Swati have said as well, is I think, there's consolidation that was inevitably going to happen. If you look at obviously where we were in the public markets a couple of years ago, where money was kind of coming from everywhere, and now we're in a very different environment. It was kind of interesting. I remember about a year and a half ago, we were talking about MDMA and psilocybin, and the feedback we kept getting was like, MDMA and psilocybin and LSD are old news, and we need to be looking at what's coming next in regards to other compounds. And we were kind of scratching our heads, sort of going like, I don't know about you, but I don't see anybody offering MDMA or psilocybin assisted psychotherapy yet. So to sort of make that assumption was I think a little bit challenging. And I think what's nice to see in regards to consolidation is you've seen a focusing or prioritizing on there's some very big questions we still have to answer. Who's going to pay for this? How is this going to integrate within the healthcare and wellness system? What's the business model? There's, as we all know, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy isn't necessarily cheap. And so how do you answer some of those bigger questions before we start talking about non-psychedelic psychedelics or LSD that lasts half as long as the LSD we have is? So I think it's good to see that there's been I would say a prioritizing or a focusing of resources towards driving towards the massive societal problem we have around mental health and mental wellness. And I think with that being prioritized, I think we're going to start to be able to answer some of the more important questions at the moment around accessibility and sustainability in the space. And I think, that consolidation or that focusing is probably going to continue while you look at groups, going back to what we were talking about before around whether it's an industry or a culture. We still have challenges, even advertising therapy in Google Ads. If you talk about using drugs with therapy, Google Ads won't let you advertise. And so, there's still some big hurdles to talk about. Just how do you get this awareness out there, and that includes education, which I think is going to be really, really key also. So I think with that, the more groups can come together and work in collaboration to try and change some of these bigger issues we have at the moment, the better. And so I think consolidation drives some of that, where organizations can come together and prioritize focusing on some of these different buckets.
Thank you. I can see where being able to focus on sometimes a good way to solve it. Lindsay, if you don't mind taking the last word on this one, Peyton just gave a great answer talking about, yes, the necessity to recognize the importance of the culture and agency while seeing the benefits of consolidation to achieve those goals. I'm going to take a stab and say you probably agree with the sentiment, but I wonder if you think it's fully formed. My guess is JLS, much like Empath, is very active in the space with younger companies. And same broad question I asked Brom, and that is, how do you decide where to focus your energy?
Well, coming at this from an investment perspective, the most predominant exit by far has been for decades M&A, not going public. So it's expected that consolidation would be ultimately where most companies end up creating value for shareholders. And we've lived through the cannabis wave. I've lived through the internet wave. Usually there's a lot of euphoria and a lot of models glommed on top of each other. Here in psychedelics, you had drug companies that also wanted to start a clinical network, that also wanted to have their own platform for software and apps for the therapists and the journey, and it's just not realistic at the very earliest stages of a company, number one, to even have those disparate goals. Number two, it's usually different teams that can execute on those goals, and there's a finite amount of capital available. So really, even before investment, we have counseled some companies. For example, I can think of a great example of a software company that had really a neat research foundation and a great approach, but none of them had ever developed software before, nor had they taken it to market. And they ultimately, before even raising their first round, merged with a company that did have that expertise. So we actually get involved in midwifing these deals even before the companies get off the ground, because if you've done this a few times, you can sort of see where it's going. And while it's a painful thing for excited founders to pass the baby over, that's the only way the baby's going to live in some cases. So at this very early stage where you're not exactly sure what's going to happen, you really do, as always, I think, no matter when you're investing, focus on the team, the quality of the team, the experience, their applicable accomplishments, whether that's from this industry or a tangential industry. How realistic are they? And do they have both the technology and or the product expertise to do what they're doing? And do they also have a sense, at least, of how they're going to take it to market, even if that's a few years away? So it really becomes a very granular, specific exercise, and it's not laden with a lot of euphoria, frankly. It's laden with a lot of practical conversations. And of course, we'd also like to see intellectual property associated with some of the drug development or device, technology. But right now, what you're seeing is a lot of patents filed without any data. So people are staking out. It's sort of like if you went west and you decided you wanted to settle California, but you only had 5 soldiers to defend it. Well, you're going to need data. So it's a very interesting and complicated landscape from that perspective. And again, it kind of comes down to, are these people who claim with these prophetic patents that they're going to stake out this space, are they going to be able to substantiate it with data where those patents are going to be defensible? So it's complicated. And we think, one of the reasons we decided to invest is this is very complicated for individual investors. It's very complicated for investors that aren't familiar with the myriad of things I've described, both from drug development, drug delivery technologies, and associated software and underlying platforms that are accelerating that. It's complicated, and it's nascent, and it's risky. And there's huge reward, we obviously think, but we think it's not the kind of thing that you easily do on a one-off basis from your couch at home.
Lindsay, so much. That answer is brilliant. I think the first half told us very clearly that psychedelics is not different than other spaces. How's your team? Do you have a well-defined purpose? Do you have an MVP? Do you have a plan to get it there, right? These questions, it's not like they don't apply to psychedelics. They apply to every industry, every early stage and actually mid or late stage company. So in that sense, we're not talking about anything new. But on the flip side, we are. Like you said, if you are settling the West and you have to have a plan for that, that is something that happened once. And with the nod to the fact that settling the West was dangerous for many persons who were already there, there is a question in the Q&A that I think leans into this a little bit, and it's from Jonathan. He asks, what can leaders in the medical psychedelics industry do to help ensure that legal reforms around religious or other cultural uses are still possible? Now, that's a big question. But when we're talking about settling a space in which there are established actors, I do want to toss this one out there. It's a bit of a regression, but what do we do when we're talking about the psychedelics industry and consolidation in it to make sure that religious and cultural uses are still possible? I'm going to toss this actually out to Swati, because from the journalistic perspective, I assume that all of these different stakeholders are going to matter. So by all means.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think something that I find really important is to continue the narrative and not lose that in the practice, and ensure that some of these biotech companies that are participating in this movement are consistently ensuring that some level of their profits are going to be redistributed to some of these communities. And just to make that a priority, ultimately, I think that there's a lot of the narrative around just the public market flow, and it's wonderful, and we're all very excited. Although, it's fluctuating constantly, and there's a lot of maybe concern lately. But I do think that ultimately we just need to ensure the sustainability of the entire, scene, movement, industry, however you want to frame it. I think that our Indigenous ancestors and religious ancestors are going to be a part of this movement. They're the ones who had established, this entire space. So I think that we need to make sure that we're cultivating that bond, because that's just symbiotic here. And I believe that just making sure that, something that we're doing through Psychedelic Spotlight is to make sure that we are covering that side of the industry, and telling their stories on a local level. So I plan to make that a bigger part of what we do in the future, and just ensuring that there's diversity that is integrated into the space.
And like every other industry, we need to remember our roots and as standing on Indigenous land. So I would love, your perspective here as well.
Sorry, I lost you a little bit, Philip, but I think you were.
I apologize. So in your introduction, you mentioned that you were standing on Indigenous land. So as we talk about respecting Indigenous religious and cultural practices that have a relationship with psychedelics, far greater than any industry, I just like your perspective on preserving those traditions.
Yeah, I think we would be very remiss if we did not engage with and look at the cultural and historical use of psychedelics within Indigenous communities. Not only the application of psychedelics within healing modalities, but one of the things we talk a lot about is integration, and how do we actually make these experiences that people are going to have, how do we create an environment and a community where those experiences are able to actually be applied to somebody's life going forward. These aren't panaceas. They're not magic pills that you take and all of your problems are alleviated. It's hard work. And you have to be able to create a community around you that speaks that language, accepts, you for the work that you're doing, and that you can cultivate practices within your life that actually make those shifts happen. And I think if you look at, this interesting conversation around integration at the moment, and if you look at Indigenous uses of psychedelics within their cultures, integration was their life. They lived in communities. There was centralized practices around it. They were in nature. All of those kinds of things were prioritized that we don't prioritize right now as a society. And I think we're seeing the big downfalls of that. The other thing I would really like to add as well in regards to Indigenous use and cultural use is, if you think about healing trauma, and that's what we talk a lot about with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, is we live, especially in the West, in a very diverse cultural set of people who come from lots of different backgrounds, and that trauma can be very specific to someone's cultural upbringing. And so when we talk about the training of practitioners and the services that we're offering, we can't just paint it with a very broad brush. And that's a lot of the work that we've been doing at Numinous, is making sure that we have cultural diversity training for different folks who are dealing with different populations or working with different populations. And I think when we talk about accessibility and how we make this scalable, is we have to have therapists, and we have to be able to prioritize working with different types of people and in a diverse way that makes it accessible and makes it prioritized to those different individuals.
Thank you. I appreciate that reframing of consolidation as integration. Important distinction to make, where if we're not just concentrating, but we're being made part of, and it might not be that we're the bigger thing. I want to throw this out to you. Again, having spent time on all of your websites, the different call out for startups that one on that list, and it's a great list. I encourage everyone to take a look at it because it really speaks to a lot of the different facets here. It's integrating psychedelics with mainstream medicine, and I love the assumptions there. Number one, that integration is necessary. Number two, that mainstream medicine is separate and apart from psychedelics, and we're finding a way to bridge the two. So, Brom, I'll toss this out to you to speak in whatever perspective that you want. But the original question, of course, was the importance of respecting religious and cultural uses, historical uses, where possible in this space. So as you are working with Empath Ventures, how do you recognize that history?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important question. For me personally, I've been a user of and a lover of psychedelics for a lot longer than I even knew that there was going to be an industry. I started kind of personal use about a decade ago, and I didn't even think there was ever going to be an industry side. So I want to see sort of the cultural and just personal use, however you want to use it, whether it's, through an indigenous tradition or just watching the clouds melt in your backyard, with some friends. I think that all of that should be available to people. I think that like the core underlying roots of all the different psychedelic traditions are just this idea of like cognitive liberty. And I think that's something that should be respected. So the question is like, how can operators in the industry actually sort of respect those cultural roots of psychedelics? And for me, one of the most actionable things that I think investors can do anyway is to not get involved, or not invest in, not support companies whose business models really rely on the continuation of the war on drugs. And some examples of that might be if you are a company who is trying to get, let's say, LSD approved by the FDA for something, you're going to spend millions of dollars running clinical trials on LSD, which is a molecule that you didn't invent, by the way. So your only hope for making money off of that business model is making sure that people can't get LSD outside of your sort of pharmaceutical FDA granted monopoly that you have. And so you are now kind of incentivized to use your resources, which you have as a company, and use your investor money to go out and speak out against decriminalization, lobby against things like Organ Measure 109, because that would, be competition for you. So one of sort of the key things that I look for in the companies that I invest in, and I think I've done a pretty reasonable job of doing this, is not investing in any companies who are going to be threatened by decriminalization, threatened by things like Measure 109, threatened by the idea of recreational legalization. I try to invest in companies that are at the very least neutral to that sort of, regulatory outcome, and at the very best actually benefit from that sort of like regulatory regime. Because the war on drugs has been horrific for indigenous groups, but also for, people like underground LSD chemists that, lost, good chunks of their lives, but to, the prison system of the war on drugs. So we want to kind of make sure that our profits are not dependent on continuing to put people in cages, so that we can, maintain our tight monopoly grip on the distribution of these substances.
Number one, it's depressing that our bar is don't put people in cages, but it's insightful because it's necessary, right? That's exactly what we've been doing. And the fact that we've been failing as a society to not do that is, different panel entirely. But I appreciate the nod. Lindsay, I do want to hear your thoughts on this, but I sort of was motivated to ask the question because of what you said. So I will do the moderator no and ask you two questions. The first is your thoughts on respecting historical uses, but also to flip that, you discussed about the entrance of not just big pharma, but also intellectual property, right? We've got patents happening. It's a different type of siloing of type of generation of scarcity, right? Necessarily the war on drugs, but to the extent I can lock up information, I am all of a sudden making myself very powerful. And is that, I want to say some of that's necessary, because intellectual property, if done correctly, means that, at least with a patent, let's say, a limited monopoly that everybody can use and generates, more value from that limited monopoly. So please speak a little bit on respecting those indigenous uses if you like, but also back to the pros and cons. Siloing data, you talked about prophetic patents, which is a beautiful phrase. At the same time, the importance of data, but there's also the risks of data. Siloing that data, putting it behind walls, what impact is that going to have on the consolidation in this industry?
Well, again, this is the world we live in, but I would agree wholeheartedly with Brom that we don't seek to invest in companies that are trying to exclude others from the therapeutic landscape. And the decriminalization and the ability for people to exercise their liberty and take these substances in whatever way they want to is essential, just as a free man or free woman's right in this world, number one. And we agree that this attempt on the part of many to patent substances which clearly are in the public domain and wrap it in some kind of therapeutic wrapper is probably not even going to succeed. So frankly, I'm a little less concerned about it. From an investor perspective, again, yeah, data, IP, those are all important things to justify the spending and investments that's made. But this is such a big tent. This is not just psilocybin. This is really everything in the jungle and the desert, et cetera, that hasn't really been explored by us as humans for wellness and optimization of our being purposes. And so I'm a little less concerned about the ring fencing and more concerned that not enough capital goes into exploring the things we haven't even found yet in the jungle and the desert that clearly likely have therapeutic value. The combination of those substances together, the dosages, the delivery format, really it's infinite. So I see it as more of a huge, just where do we start, where do we place our first, seeds, so to speak. But something struck me about this. What's so interesting and why we are so optimistic and why we were really driven to invest in this area is, why are psychedelics so impactful? Because they're not like any other drug. When you talk about culture and religion, what I think about are meaning and connection. And that's what we're losing in this modern world: connection to each other, connection to a bigger purpose, meaning in our lives. Clearly, we're lost, right? And all the things we were taught to believe in, either we don't believe in them anymore, or they don't work anymore, or we question them in the context of technology and super rapid change. And even without the drugs, even without the psychedelic plants, those indigenous cultures, and I think, like you said, Peyton, kind of the, or both of you, the integration of meaning and relatedness to everyday life, if that's all we took and we even left the plants, on the side, we would benefit hugely. So that really, that understanding and that restarting of people's sense of what really matters and how they're going to bring that into their life, to me, is one of the biggest elements of psychedelics, aside from helping grandma get over her anxiety, in terms of why is this a quantum leap in mental health? And that it's a quantum leap because it helps people reset the trough that they might be in and reform their life in a way that's much more beneficial to them. And unfortunately, integration really is key to any kind of behavioral health intervention, whether psychedelics are involved or not, because as we know, if you go back to your same old habits and your same old thing, you're likely to have the same old misery you had before. This is a huge challenge for any human being. So to have catalysts like the clouds melting in the sky and what psychedelics can do on the one hand, and also the recognition that, gee, I need to incorporate meaning and connection into my life to enjoy my life and to have it mean something to me, are part of why this is just so powerful. I'm sorry if I didn't really answer either question, but
well, but I think that you did, right? I think it is important to recognize data and intellectual property, but at the same time, what I heard you say was, it's the relationships that matter. It's the insight that matters, and thankfully, neither of those are patentable. So that process is always going to be useful. And the fact that we can do it now with, I'll say, new substances, but substances that hitherto have not been used is like you said, a giant leap forward. And we should sort of continue in that vein. So we're already 43 minutes in, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about regulation, right? So not just criminalization, but we're talking about industries that are touching many different aspects of regulation. You've got the idea of, you just go to old-fashioned corporate entities, right? Can you invest into a company that's, focusing on? Got the SEC talking about, well, what's the best way to raise funds for situations like this? Got the different intellectual property organizations, be it Canadian or American, talking about what you can and can't patent. I'll ask a very broad question to everybody, and I'll start with you, Peyton. Having, because your business is, you're cross-border, you're probably multi-regulated. Please pick a regulator and ask them for a favor, and just, so this is very freeform and very broad, I know, but if there's anything you could ask a regulator, what would it be, and why?
Yeah, I think, I agree with a lot of what people have been saying on the panel around, what I would like to see is much more broad spread regulation. I think everybody has their right to be able to explore their own consciousness, whether, as Brom mentioned, watching the clouds change form in their backyard. But also, I think we would be naive in forgetting that there's a lot of people who are very severely suffering at the moment. And while psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, whether that's underground or above ground, in ceremony, is still expensive and challenging for people. Meanwhile, I live in Canada. We have a universal healthcare system. I can get all kinds of pharmaceutical drugs paid for by my universal healthcare system. Insurance providers will pay for antidepressants and SSRIs. So we need to think about those communities as well, and how do we have the healthcare system actually work for us and help some of those people who I'm sure would love the opportunity to be able to have some of those kinds of experiences, while also, deeply suffering with trauma or depression, PTSD, and the idea of being able to, join one of those ceremonies, might not get them what they need. From what we see, for a lot of people who reach out to us, they are people who have explored with psychedelics and are really hoping to be able to work with a trained practitioner or provider who can really help them unlock the potential of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy or just psychedelics within a ceremonial context. So I would like to see a regulation change that supports broad spread use of psychedelics, but that also does support whether that's a more financially sustainable model where it can integrate with the healthcare system, and for people who are looking to alleviate serious indications and serious suffering can get the financial support and the regulatory support for that. So it's a broad answer to the question, but I think we need to look at this from a number of different stakeholders' standpoint when we're talking about regulation change.
Oh, it is broad, but I think so is the topic. I think cognitive liberty was tossed out as a concept, which is certainly not narrow. Swati, you have the finger on the pulse of not only business, but also these regulators. It might be inappropriate to ask a journalist to ask a favor of a regulator, but if you don't mind answering, if there were a change you'd like to see in how the space is regulated, what would it be?
I think that it's a little early on for us to understand how everything will be regulated on kind of a mass scale, but I do think that it's important for us to make sure that this industry doesn't move in the direction as the larger pharmaceutical companies have in the States specifically. I have major concerns personally, and I'm sure a lot of people share this, that psychedelic therapies and psychedelic medicines will be extremely expensive. And communities that need access to those medications won't be able to without the insurance, and many people are uninsured in the States. And so this is something that I would really like for us to kind of, not lose sight of, that we need to figure out a way to make sure that, when we're talking consolidation, we have those potentially few companies that are going to be left that are going to be essentially kind of like running the entire biotech area. And how are they going to ensure that their medicines and medications are accessible to communities of color and communities from impoverished areas in the States? So that's definitely something that I'd like to stay aware of.
Yes, that consolidation is difficult. I think, as Brom mentioned, right, the generation of scarcity is not the business model we're going. I will toss out, some of my favorite uses of decentralized autonomous organizations at the moment are making different therapies or drugs, if not accessible, they're at least researching them. In many cases, because those drugs are just not seen as profitable to research or develop or sell by exactly these giant gatekeepers. So I'll toss that out as a solution to the problem. Together, we have a million ways to do that. And even new ones that are working. We're figuring it out as we go along. Brom, I will toss out this question to you, right? As you're in a different space than Peyton and Swati. I mean, to state the obvious, but in terms of regulators, you have rules that apply to you too. Are there any that you're running into full on lately that you're just like, I get it, but I wish it was different?
There haven't been any regulations that have really impacted the investing activities. Obviously, we can't invest in any company that is just straight up selling mushrooms or anything in a gray market or black market context. That would be great if we could do that, but not yet. One thing I'm still sort of trying to figure out is what the rules around investing in businesses that might be operating in like Oregon might be. This is something that I don't know the answer to. It's very easy to invest in a company that is, developing a biotech substance through the FDA, or developing software to help with like psychedelic accessories. But the question around like, can we invest in companies that are producing mushrooms for sale exclusively in Oregon, following all the Oregon laws, but breaking sort of the federal laws, is something that I, assume would be problematic. And so for now, we haven't really done that. And I think this will be kind of an ever evolving landscape. We don't want to see the same thing happen here that happened in cannabis, where all these companies like couldn't get banking, couldn't open a bank account, basically had to deal with cash. And it's something that I wish I had the time to stay more on top of. But maybe someone else on the panel has a better idea of what things are going to look like for businesses operating in Oregon. But that's a big area of interest and sort of concern for me from an investment perspective.
Yeah, and it's a great call out, and it's at least one way in which cannabis and psychedelics are similar, right? I mean, lack of access to the banking system is just it's an enormous hurdle that I'm seeing some creative solutions toward. Things simple yet. So, by all means, audience, if you have a suggestion, let us know, because right now the Goldbergian machines we have to create to make banking possible is expensive and ridiculous. There's a question from the audience that I want to take, and because I think it's a very practical one, right? Tend towards the the 50,000-60,000 foot stuff, because that's what makes my balls spin. But the very practical question is, Oregon is only allowing oral psilocybin products for the first year, and the questioner asks, how will this affect people in hospice, for example, who can't take medications orally, right? It's a simple question, but Oregon is held out as certainly a front runner, as a leader here. And yet maybe I'm misinterpreting, but that seems like a really big miss, right? Because oral is not necessarily the only way to take these things. So on the ground, the question is, what do we do about people who can't participate in this therapy orally? And number two, Oregon is the lead. You know what? I'll save that question. I'll just ask the very simple one, right? What do we do about people who can't participate legally because they can't ingest it orally? I'll actually toss that up to you, Lindsay. You have space. You have nothing there.
Well, we're focused more on the national landscape, frankly, and one thing that is heartening about how this industry is developing is that it's medicalizing in a way that cannabis didn't. And I think some of the people that were the pioneers here learned that we should really try to be under the umbrella of the FDA, which did grant breakthrough designations. I'll hand them that. And I think they're trying to recognize that these drugs are not those that have no currently accepted medical use, or they won't be if they're allowed to go through trials. So our hope is that this banking snafu that has and this ridiculous 3-level kind of alcohol sort of derived state by state legislation model does not impact psychedelics. And it's unfortunate that the states appear to be taking their playbook from cannabis, because that's not, the easy or smartest way to go, but it's the easiest way for regulators to just go, oh, well, it worked before, so we'll do it here. But this is a very different situation. So I can only hope that the fact that every single leading academic institution in the world, pretty much, and every leading kind of expert in psychedelic therapy and therapeutics and mental health really believes this stuff is going to work, and they're investing now, tells me that hopefully we will leapfrog this problem wholly in favor of people doing whatever they want in whatever state. And it probably will go that way, but let's hopefully try to nudge this ball further, where we get enough positive results from initial clinical trials that prove there is medical validity. And in fact, these things are hugely effective, which is the only reason the FDA is doing it. They're out of tricks, right? This is a crisis, multiple crises of addiction and depression, and people just dropping out, not wanting to work. People are losing their excitement about life. It has ramifications. So we're a little focused on the bigger picture. So yeah, I don't really have a specific answer to the oral question of Oregon.
Thankfully, our audience does. They're tossing out suggestions to me like, come on, this means tinctures, drops, and hospice work. Oral can include solutions, liquid, sublingual, right? A million different ways to administer it. I see you, audience. I appreciate your comments. I think what we're going to run into, though, is statute versus regulations, right? Statute says one thing and the regulations say another. And in terms of how oral, quote unquote, is interpreted is going to be very important. Peyton, I see your hand up. Please let us know.
Yeah, I think if there's a place where industry, plays a role, it should be around this kind of innovation. It should be looking at, where some of the scalability problems and innovating and creating solutions that make these different compounds more accessible for people. So whether that's delivery mechanisms or technology that maybe can support things like integration, I think that's where there's an opportunity. I think some of the steps that Oregon has done to prioritize natural psilocybin is fantastic. It keeps out the sort of predatory pharmaceutical kind of model that we've seen, and keeps things much more neutral and kind of tied to the roots. And we do some work in natural psilocybin, and Mother Nature has been working on these compounds and delivery mechanisms for a very long time, and I think she's done a pretty phenomenal job to date. So I think if we can continue to have that prioritizing of resources go towards how do we actually solve, again, some of these bigger problems that we've seen. I think to go back to the conversation around patents and IP and in particular around compounds, we have things like open science pledges, which I think open science pledges around these different compounds solves, a lot of those problems where, if you look at what MAPS has done with MDMA, there's an open science pledge there. You can go online and pull all of the data that they've derived. That continues to advance these different compounds forward from a regulatory standpoint. And creates a lot more space for innovation and different tools and technologies to be able to support that. Now, if I'm, some other organizations in the space that are looking to raise capital in order to have their piece of the pie, if that's how you want to call it, that might be challenging. But I do think in the Open Science Pledge, it very clearly spells out what are the intentions for folks who are not a part of that pledge, and why are they not a part of it, and what is the intention of those that are.
It's a great point. I think, again, just to lean on distributed ledger technology, that to make sure information is available. Brom, I don't know if you want to comment on the idea of
Could you repeat whatever you just asked? Sorry, it cut out.
Sure. So the question that someone from the audience asked was, Oregon is allowing oral psilocybin products for the first year.
Yeah.
How will that affect the persons who want to engage in the therapy but can't do so orally? It seems to be, a bit of a miss. And the question was sort of on the ground, what does that mean for the industry?
Yeah.
Also, is it a problem to solve, or is it just sort of a first mover bad drafting?
I mean, it's probably just a bad drafting thing that will probably get fixed. My first instinct was to react by, saying that there's tinctures and other like oral forms that maybe don't require chewing, but the audience kind of beat me to it. I guess the only other thing I would add is that, if you're, in hospice on your deathbed, maybe don't worry about following the law that much. I don't know.
Not wrong, folks. Okay, so we are coming up on time, and I want to ask a question. It's broad, but I think one of the themes I've heard from all of you today is the importance of agency, importance of, again, the term that I love is cognitive liberty, about how this is a way for each of us, if we want to take control of new ways to take control, or new ways to lose control in a method to find ourselves. So if I was coming to you and I was brand new and said, hey, I've heard about these really cool new therapies, for just that individual person, what should they do in the space if they want to take advantage of culture, industry, space, ecosystem? Lindsay, I'll start with you, please.
I'm afraid we lost the end of the question again. What would you say to a person who wants to take advantage of
this space, this industry, this ecosystem, these products, this therapy? What advice do you have for the individual person curious who wants to take part?
I think it kind of depends on who they are and where they are geographically, but also where they are and why. Some people are looking for the personal growth associated. Some people are looking for help with trauma. I would say it's somewhat individualized. We certainly all have our network of go-to people. Luckily, there are also, I think, some communities, some of the companies we've invested in are trying to create platforms where people can communicate about what they're looking to achieve, what their problems are, issues, and even get down to the geographical of there's a therapist in your area, or here's a group you might want to. So, the modern sort of social media / app world can really diffuse a lot of information broadly. And hopefully, again, that happens in a way that isn't so commercially driven. But I think when a lot of the therapists that are involved are so committed, and there will be the need for thousands more therapists, but they're a really good resource. Any therapist associated with psychedelic therapy or interested in it are probably a good resource for people to at least start getting information. And then a lot of that depends on, where you live. Are you in the United States? Are you in another country? There's some wonderful retreats, of course, that are not accessible financially for everyone. There are also, I think, nonprofits arising to help fund, people's access, as I think Swati talked about before. How do people get access if they can't afford it? So luckily, I think all that's in the works. And right now, I guess I would look at some of the networks that are out there where that information is being distributed, and try to check out a few to see what makes you comfortable and where you feel like you're not being sold something, but you're being provided information and guidance.
Yeah, I guess my fear of that is there's a lot of probably disinformation out there too. So we need some good curated sources.
We need people to start learning how to analyze information and how they can consume information in this world, as opposed to just believing everything they see. But yes, absolutely. Getting back to cognitive liberty, and there's a little bit of responsibility involved.
Peyton, please, if you have the advice for the person looking to get into this therapy for the first time, what would it be?
Yeah, I agree with Lindsay. I think it comes down to the individual and what's resonating for them, or what they're looking for. Going back to the conversation around the cultural shift that we're seeing in regards to the use of psychedelics, it resonates for many people very differently. For some people, it's cognitive liberty. For some people, it's a spiritual journey and work that they're doing, and for other people, they might not be able to see any of that because they're suffering so badly with a mental health indication that those concepts sound nice, but to them, they need to try and alleviate that suffering. And I think we've talked a lot about indigenous or cultural use, and I encourage a lot of people to look at the historical and cultural use of psychedelics. As an example, there's a lot of different indigenous cultures where ayahuasca was used in their cultures, but it wasn't used in the way that we look at it, where people use ayahuasca for their healing. It was actually one person within the community who was a healer who would use ayahuasca to explore different healing modalities, and then would take those teachings to help try and heal their community. And they were the only person in the community who was really using that medicine. So there's been lots of different applications of the use of psychedelics within different cultures and different communities. And I encourage, if people are looking for how to navigate the spaces, really look at what is it, what are their needs, what are they looking for, and then really look at the historical use, and look at what science has all science is really doing right now is validating things that we've known for thousands and thousands of years. It's just giving a different perspective. And so encourage people to look at what we've seen in some of the FDA work that we've seen as well.
I'm being told to wrap up. Brom, Swati, I want to give you each a chance to sort of give advice to that new user, that person approaching the space. So Brom, I'll let you go first, if you could please do it, but do it quickly if you can, please.
Yeah, I'll keep it simple. Do it with someone you trust in a safe space, and don't eat too much before.
To the point, people. That's why we love him. Swati, please, if you could wrap it up and give us your succinct advice for the person approaching this space for the first time.
Sure. So I would say just think critically about what you're engaging in. These are really, really powerful substances, medicines, however you prefer to frame it. I would agree with what Peyton had said, that we can kind of examine the entire context and understand the different avenues of how we can engage in these practices, and just see what makes the most sense for you, but also just give it the respect that it deserves, and make sure that you're being safe in the process.
So thank you all so much. I just want to appreciate this panel for joining us today. I appreciate you, audience. Your insightful comments are great. By all means, let's keep on journeying in this space. And if we could just quickly thank Lindsay Hoover, the managing partner at JLS Fund, Brom Rector, the founder of Empath Ventures, Swati Sharma, the executive director of Psychedelic Spotlight, and Peyton Nyquist, the CEO and founder of Numinous. Thank you all so much this morning for joining me in a conversation about consolidation in the psychedelics industry, what to expect.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.